13-year-old Kelvin adjusted his baseball cap and stared out the window of his bedroom. The sky outside was a mix of orange and purple hues as the sun dipped below the horizon, but Kelvin's thoughts were far away. He clutched a worn photo album in his lap, the leather edges frayed from years of flipping through it. Inside were pictures of his life, his first steps, birthday parties, family vacations. His adopted parents, Michael and Katie, were in nearly every photo, beaming with pride. They were the best parents a kid could ask for, and Kelvin knew he was lucky. But there was a piece of his story missing. "I want to find them," Kelvin had told his parents over dinner one night. "My birth parents. I think I'm ready." Michael and Katie exchanged a glance. It wasn't the first time Kelvin had brought it up, but the way he said it this time carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Katie reached across the table and took Kelvin's hand. "We'll help you," she said, her voice warm and steady. "We've always known this day might come." Michael nodded. "You're a part of our family, Kelvin. That will never change. But if finding your birth parents is something you need, we'll do whatever we can to support you." Kelvin's heart swelled with gratitude. He had heard stories about adopted kids who were afraid to bring up their birth parents, worried it would hurt their adoptive families. But Michael and Katie had always been open about his adoption. They'd told him the truth when he was 6, sitting him down in the living room with all the seriousness of sharing a family secret. "You didn't come from Mommy's belly," Katie had explained, brushing a strand of dark hair from Kelvin's face. "But you came straight into our hearts. We chose you, and we've loved you since the moment we met you." At the time, Kelvin had nodded and gone back to playing with his toy cars. It wasn't until he got older and noticed the subtle differences, the way his brown eyes and curly hair stood out in a sea of blondes and blue eyes at family gatherings, that he began to wonder about where he came from. Michael and Katie came from large families, and while Kelvin was showered with love from his aunts, uncles, and cousins, the secret of his adoption was too big to keep hidden. "It's better if he hears it from us," Katie had said, and Michael had agreed. They wanted Kelvin to feel secure in his identity, to know the truth from the start. Now, as Kelvin sat on his bed, he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about what lay ahead. His parents had already started making calls to the adoption agency and the hospital where he was born. They had never met his birth mother. She had chosen to remain anonymous, leaving only a few details behind. But Michael and Katie were determined to help Kelvin uncover the rest of the story. Kelvin flipped through the photo album again and paused on a picture of himself as a baby, swaddled in a soft blue blanket. His tiny face was scrunched up in a yawn, and Katie's arms cradled him with the tenderness of a mother who had waited her whole life for that moment. "I love them so much," Kelvin thought, tracing the photo with his finger. "But I need to know where I come from." He closed the album and set it aside, his resolve strengthening. With Michael and Katie by his side, he felt ready to take the first steps on this journey, a journey to find the missing pieces of his story, to discover who he was before he became theirs. Michael sat in his home office, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. A manila folder lay on the desk in front of him, its contents heavy with meaning. Across from him, Mr. Cooley, a sharp-dressed lawyer with graying temples, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "I've found Kelvin's birth parents," Mr. Cooley began, his voice calm but serious. "It wasn't easy, but the adoption records provided enough breadcrumbs to piece together their current whereabouts." Michael nodded, his hands clasped tightly together. He wasn't sure how he felt, relieved, nervous, or something in between. All he knew was that Kelvin had been asking for this, and as his father, Michael wanted to do everything he could to help his son. "What did you find?" Michael asked, his tone steady but his heart racing. Mr. Cooley opened the folder and began laying out the details. "Kelvin's biological father, Marcus Whitfield, has had a troubled history. He's been in and out of jail for various offenses, mostly minor theft and drug possession. Currently, he's incarcerated again, serving a 2-year sentence." Michael sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. That wasn't the news he had hoped for, but it wasn't entirely unexpected. "And his mother?" "Her name is Elena Torres," Mr. Cooley said, sliding a photograph across the desk. Michael picked it up and studied the image. It was a candid shot, likely taken from her social media. Elena was a petite woman with kind eyes and a tired but genuine smile. Her dark hair was pulled back, and she wore a simple uniform, a hotel name tag pinned to her chest. "She's married now," Mr. Cooley continued. "Her husband is a mechanic, and they have a daughter, about 4 years old. They seem to live a quiet life. Elena works at a mid-range hotel downtown as a housekeeper." Michael felt a wave of emotions wash over him. He imagined the woman in the photo, scrubbing floors and changing sheets, all while raising a young child. What had driven her to give up Kelvin all those years ago? Did she think about him? Miss him? "She left very few details when she placed Kelvin for adoption," Mr. Cooley added. "But from what I've gathered, she was young, alone, and overwhelmed. Giving him up might have been the hardest decision she ever made." Michael placed the photo back on the desk. "Does she know we're looking for her?" "She does now," Mr. Cooley said. "I reached out to her discreetly. She was surprised, of course, but also emotional. She said she's thought about Kelvin every day since she gave him up. She told me she'd like to meet him if he's open to it." Michael's chest tightened. This was it, the possibility of bringing Kelvin face to face with the woman who had given him life. But he knew he had to tread carefully. Kelvin was still young, and this meeting could be overwhelming, even if it was something he wanted. "What about Marcus?" Michael asked. "Does he know?" Mr. Cooley shook his head. "Given his circumstances, I thought it best to approach him later, if Kelvin decides he wants to pursue that avenue. For now, I focused on Elena." Michael nodded, grateful for the lawyer's discretion. He sat back in his chair, staring at the photograph of Elena and the sparse details Mr. Cooley had gathered about her life. He thought about Kelvin, his earnest brown eyes, his determination to find the missing pieces of his story. "What do you recommend?" Michael finally asked. Mr. Cooley folded his hands. "I think it's important to take things slowly. A meeting with Elena could be an emotional experience for everyone involved. I suggest starting with a private conversation between you and her. If you feel she's sincere and ready, you can arrange for Kelvin to meet her." Michael considered this. He trusted Mr. Cooley's judgment, but, more importantly, he wanted to protect Kelvin. The boy had been through so much already, even if he didn't always show it. Michael wanted this to be a positive experience, not one that left Kelvin with more questions than answers. "All right," Michael said. "Let's set up a meeting, but I want to meet her first, alone." 2 days later, Michael sat in a quiet coffee shop downtown, waiting for Elena to arrive. He felt out of place in the bustling cafe, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the hiss of espresso machines. He hadn't told Kelvin about the meeting yet. He didn't want to get his hopes up until he was sure this was the right step. The door swung open, and a petite woman walked in, her eyes scanning the room nervously. Michael recognized her from the photograph. He stood and waved, and she approached hesitantly, clutching her purse tightly. "Mr. Clark?" she asked softly. "Please call me Michael," he said, extending his hand. She shook it, her grip firm despite her obvious nerves. They sat across from each other, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Michael could see the emotion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Elena finally said. I've thought about this moment for so long, but I never knew if it would actually happen," Michael nodded. "Kelvin is an amazing boy," he said. "He's smart, kind, curious. Katie and I feel so lucky to have him in our lives." Elena smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so glad. I always hoped he'd end up with a family who could give him everything I couldn't." Michael leaned forward, his tone gentle but direct. "He wants to meet you, Elena. He's been asking questions about where he came from, about you. But I need to know. Are you ready for this? Meeting him could bring up a lot of emotions for both of you." Elena took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together. "I think I am," she said. "I've made mistakes in my life, but giving Kelvin up was the hardest thing I've ever done. I want him to know that it wasn't because I didn't love him. I want to tell him everything." Michael studied her face, looking for any signs of hesitation or insincerity. But all he saw was a mother who had carried a heavy burden for 13 years. "All right," he said finally. "I'll talk to Kelvin and see how he feels about meeting you. We'll take things one step at a time." Elena nodded, wiping away a tear. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. For being the father he deserves. Michael felt a lump in his throat. He reached across the table and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. We both love him, he said simply. That's what matters most. Michael leaned back in his chair, his coffee untouched as Elena's question hung in the air. How did you find me? She asked again, her voice trembling slightly. Michael hesitated before answering. He wanted to choose his words carefully, knowing that the truth might stir emotions Elena wasn't ready to confront. Our son, Kelvin, wanted to know where he came from, Michael began, his tone gentle. He did one of those DNA tests, and through it we were able to find some relatives. From there, our attorney, Mr. Cooley, pieced together the rest. Elena's eyes widened and she nodded slowly. I never thought anyone would come looking for me, especially not him. Michael studied her expression, noticing the mix of relief, fear, and sadness. Elena, he said softly, I know this must be overwhelming, but Kelvin is a great kid. He's curious about his roots, about you. If you're ready, I think meeting him could mean a lot to both of you. Elena bit her lip, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She took a shaky breath and clasped her hands tightly on the table. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about Kelvin's father. Michael leaned in, listening intently. Brad and I had a toxic relationship, Elena began. We were young when we met, and at first I thought he was everything I wanted. But he wasn't. He was controlling, angry, and always getting into trouble with the law. When I got pregnant, things only got worse. He wasn't happy about the baby. Elena paused, her hands trembling. Michael waited, giving her the space to continue. He started threatening me, she said, her voice cracking, telling me that if I didn't do what he said, he'd hurt me, or worse, hurt my baby. I tried to leave, but he always found a way to pull me back. Michael felt a wave of anger rise within him, but he kept it in check. That sounds awful, Elena. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Elena nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. I knew I had to protect my baby. When Kelvin was born, I saw Brad's temper spiraling out of control. He was furious that I went into labor and didn't cook his dinner before going to the hospital. Brad said he will not come second to no baby or to anyone. I mean no one. Do you understand, Elena? Or you will find yourself childless. I realized that as long as Brad was in my life, my baby wasn't safe. She took another deep breath, her gaze fixed on the table. So I ran. I left the hospital without telling anyone where I was going. I stayed in a shelter for a few days and made the hardest decision of my life. I gave my baby up for adoption, hoping he'd find a family who could give him the safety and love I couldn't. Michael felt a lump in his throat. The weight of Elena's story hit him like a punch to the chest. You did what you had to do, he said quietly. You protected him. Elena looked up, her eyes filled with pain and longing. Do you think he'll understand? That I didn't abandon him because I didn't love him? I did it because I loved him so much that I couldn't risk Brad hurting him. Michael reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on hers. Kelvin is a thoughtful, kind boy. He'll understand, and Katie and I will help him every step of the way. Elena's lips quivered into a small smile, though tears still ran down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered, for raising him, for giving him a good life. Michael shook his head. You gave him life, Elena. Katie and I were just lucky enough to be the ones to raise him. We've always seen it that way. Elena nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. I'm ready to meet him, she said. I'm nervous, but I've waited 13 years for this moment. I hope he will forgive me. Michael smiled, his voice full of reassurance. I'm sure does. He's the one who started this journey. He wants to know you, Elena, and I think this could be a healing experience for both of you. Elena nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you, Michael, for everything. As they wrapped up their meeting, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a clearer understanding of Elena's past and the sacrifices she had made to protect Kelvin. He knew it wouldn't be an easy road ahead, but he also knew that with patience and compassion, Kelvin's journey to uncover his roots could lead to healing, understanding, and a stronger sense of identity. When Michael returned home that evening, Kelvin was sitting at the kitchen table, his homework spread out in front of him. He looked up expectantly as Michael walked in. Did you meet her? Kelvin asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and apprehension. Michael nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. I did, he said, and she's ready to meet you, if you're ready. Kelvin's face lit up with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Really? Really, Michael said, smiling. But we'll take it one step at a time. This is your journey, Kelvin, and we'll be here for you every step of the way. Elena stepped into the small but cozy home she shared with her husband, Dan, and their 4-year-old daughter, Shelley. The air was filled with the smell of dinner, a mix of roasted chicken and garlic bread. Dan stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables, while Shelley played with a set of brightly colored blocks in the living room. Hey, you're back, Dan said, glancing up as Elena closed the door behind her. He immediately noticed the mixed emotions on her face. Was it relief, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite place? How did it go? Elena dropped her purse on the counter and sank into a chair at the kitchen table. It was intense, she admitted. But good. Michael was kind, and he said Kelvin wants to meet me. Dan set the knife down and joined her at the table, his brow furrowed with concern. Are you okay? I think so, Elena said, her voice soft. It was emotional. Michael told me about Kelvin, how amazing he is, how much he wants to understand where he came from. She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. Dan, he's such a good kid. I could see it in Michael's eyes when he talked about him. Dan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You did the right thing back then, Elena. You gave Kelvin a chance at a safe, stable life. And now, it sounds like he's ready to understand why you made that choice. Elena nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I just hope he'll forgive me. I want him to know it wasn't because I didn't love him. It was because I love him too much to allow anyone to hurt him. Dan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. He'll understand. He has good parents who've raised him with love, and now he'll get to know the truth from you. Elena leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his support. After a moment, she pulled back and glanced toward the living room, where Shelley was giggling as she built a tower of blocks. There's something else, Elena said, her tone serious. We need to tell Shelley. She has a big brother, and soon she might get to meet him. Dan blinked, surprised, but quickly nodded. You're right. She deserves to know. They called Shelley into the living room too, sitting down on the couch next to them. The little girl looked up at them with her wide, curious eyes, clutching a red block in her small hand. What's up, Mommy? Daddy? She asked, sensing their serious expressions. Elena smiled softly and took her daughter's hand. Shelley, sweetie, Mommy has something very special to tell you. Shelley tilted her head, her interest piqued. What is it? Elena exchanged a quick glance with Dan, who nodded encouragingly. You know how you always say you wish you had a big brother? Elena began. Shelley's eyes lit up. Yeah, a big brother would be so fun. Elena's smile grew, though her voice was tinged with emotion. Well, you do have a big brother, Shelley. His name is Kelvin, and he's 13 years old. Shelley gasped, her hands flying to her cheeks. I do? Really? Yes, you do, Dan said, his voice warm. But Kelvin hasn't lived with us. He was adopted by another family when he was a baby. Why didn't he stay with us? Shelley asked, her small brow furrowing in confusion. Elena took a deep breath, steeling herself for the explanation. It's a little complicated, sweetie. When Kelvin was born, Mommy wasn't in a good place to take care of him. I wanted to make sure he had a safe and happy home, so I made a very hard decision to let another family adopt him. Shelley's lips pressed into a small pout, her young mind trying to process the information. Does he know about me? Not yet, Elena said gently. But he's going to, and someday soon, you might get to meet him. Shelley's face brightened again. Really? I get to meet my big brother? Oh, I can't wait. I'm going to show him my toys and my blocks, and he can play with me, right? Elena chuckled, her heart lightened by Shelley's enthusiasm. We'll see, sweetie, but first, Mommy needs to talk to him a little more. It might take some time. Okay, Shelley said, already turning back to her blocks with a newfound sense of excitement. She glanced up at her parents with a big smile. I'm so happy I have a brother. Dan and Elena exchanged a look, relief and hope passing between them. As Shelley returned to her play, Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope that the pieces of her past might finally come together. Not just for her, but for Kelvin, for Shelley, and for the family they could become. The next morning, Elena sat on the edge of her couch, her phone pressed to her ear. She had spent the night rehearsing what she wanted to say to Michael, her stomach in knots over the upcoming meeting with Kelvin. When Michael picked up, his warm voice immediately eased her nerves. "Michael," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I wanted to ask if Kelvin might be open to meeting my whole family. My husband, Dan, and our daughter Shelley are ready to meet him. Only if he's ready, of course. No pressure." Michael paused for a moment before responding. "I'll talk to Kelvin about it. He's been looking forward to meeting you, Elena, so I think he'll want to take things one step at a time, but I'll ask him and let you know." "Thank you," Elena said sincerely. "I don't want to overwhelm him. I just want him to know that he's welcome in our family whenever he's ready." After the call, Michael approached Kelvin, who was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal and scrolling through his phone. "Hey, bud," Michael said, sitting down beside him. "I talked to your birth mom this morning. She wanted to know if you'd like to meet her whole family, her husband, Dan, and your little sister, Shelley." Kelvin looked up, his spoon frozen midair. "I have a sister?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise and curiosity. "Yeah," Michael said, smiling. "She's 4 years old, and from what I hear, she's pretty excited to meet you." Kelvin hesitated, his thoughts churning. "That sounds really cool, but I think I want to meet Elena first, you know? Just her, so I can get to know her a little before meeting everyone else." Michael nodded, his respect for his son growing even more. "That makes sense. I'll let her know." Later that day, Kelvin found himself sitting in a quiet park, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees. He nervously fidgeted with the zipper on his hoodie, his heart pounding in anticipation. Across from him on a weathered wooden bench sat Elena. She had brought a small fall photo album, which now rested on her lap. "Hi, Kelvin," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "I'm so glad you wanted to meet me." "Hi," Kelvin said, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't stop staring at her. There was something familiar in her face, something that felt like looking into a mirror and seeing himself reflected back. They spent the next hour talking. Elena answered Kelvin's questions as honestly as she could, explaining her difficult past, her relationship with his birth father, and the reasons she had made the choice to give him up for adoption. "I wanted to keep you safe," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I did it because I loved you so much." Kelvin nodded, his emotions a mixture of relief, sadness, and understanding. "I'm glad you told me," he said. "I've always wondered about where I came from, and now I know." Before they parted, Elena opened the photo album and showed Kelvin pictures of her life, her wedding to Dan, moments with Shelley, and even a few of her younger years. "She's really cute," Kelvin said, pointing to a picture of Shelley holding a stuffed bunny. "I think I'd like to meet her." Elena's face lit up with joy. "She's been so excited to meet you. I think it'll mean the world to her." The next day, Michael drove Kelvin to Elena's house. The boy's nerves were palpable as they pulled into the driveway. Michael reached over and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this, Kelvin," he said. "Take it at your own pace." Kelvin nodded and stepped out of the car. Elena greeted him at the door, her smile warm and welcoming. Inside, Dan stood by the kitchen, looking slightly nervous but friendly, and Shelley peeked out from behind his legs, her big brown eyes wide with curiosity. Kelvin took a deep breath and stepped into the living room. Shelley's face lit up like a firework. She let out a squeal of excitement and bolted across the room, throwing her tiny arms around Kelvin's waist. "Hi, Kevin," she exclaimed, her voice bubbling with joy. "I love you." Kelvin froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden hug. Then he smiled, wrapping his arms around his little sister. I love you too," he said, the words coming naturally, even though they surprised him. Shelley pulled back, her eyes sparkling. "Do you want to play with my blocks? I'll show you how to build a castle." Kelvin chuckled. "Sure, Shelley, that sounds awesome." Dan stepped forward, extending his hand to Kelvin. "Hi, Kevin." "I'm Dan," he said, his voice steady and kind. "It's really great to finally meet you." Kelvin shook his hand. "Nice to meet you too." The rest of the afternoon was filled with laughter, conversations, and a surprising sense of ease. Shelley proudly showed Kelvin her toys, asking him endless questions about his favorite games, animals, and colors. Elena and Dan watched from the kitchen, their hearts swelling with gratitude at the sight of their family beginning to come together. As the sun began to set, Kelvin found himself sitting on the couch with Shelley nestled against his side, her small hand clutching his. Elena and Dan sat across from them, and Michael stood near the doorway, smiling as he watched the scene unfold. For the first time, Kelvin felt like he truly understood where he came from and where he belonged. He had two families now, each unique and special in its own way, and as Shelley dozed off against him, murmuring, "I'm so glad you're my big brother," Kelvin felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he was missing. The days following his meeting with Elena and her family were a whirlwind of emotions for Kelvin. He had spent hours replaying his conversations with Elena in his mind, marveling at Shelley's exuberant energy and feeling a new sense of connection to the family he never knew he had. But there was one subject that lingered in the back of his mind. His birth father, Marcus. Michael and Katie had told Kelvin about Marcus's troubled history, and Elena had filled in the gaps with her own painful experiences. Kelvin had learned that Marcus had been in and out of jail, struggled with substance abuse, and had a history of abusive behavior. It was hard to process, but the more Kelvin thought about it, the more certain he became. "I don't think I want to meet him," Kelvin admitted to Michael one evening as they sat in the living room. Katie sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee. "It just doesn't feel right. I don't think he's someone I want in my life." Michael nodded, his expression filled with understanding. "That's a mature decision, Kelvin. This is your journey, and you get to decide who's a part of your life. We'll support you no matter what." Katie smiled warmly. "You've built such a strong connection with Elena and her family. That's something to celebrate. You don't have to force a relationship with anyone who you don't feel safe to be around." Kelvin felt a sense of relief at their words. He didn't feel pressured or judged, only supported. Unbeknownst to Kelvin, a storm was brewing. One of Elena's extended family members, a cousin who had always been too eager to gossip, had mentioned to Marcus that Kelvin had been meeting with Elena. The news had sparked something in Marcus, a mix of curiosity, anger, and a twisted sense of entitlement. For years, he had been absent from Kelvin's life, but now that he knew where his son was, he decided to take action. Several days later, a knock at the door interrupted a peaceful evening at the Clark household. Michael opened the door to find a man in his early 40s, dressed in a cheap suit and holding an envelope. "Mr. Michael Clark?" the man asked, his tone businesslike. "Yes," Michael replied cautiously. The man handed him the envelope. "You've been served. Marcus Whitfield is filing for joint custody of Kevin Whitfield." Michael's stomach dropped as he took the envelope. He muttered a thank you and closed the door, his hands trembling as he opened the paperwork. Katie came into the hallway, her face etched with concern. "What is it?" she asked. Michael handed her the papers. "Marcus, he's trying to get joint custody of Kelvin." Katie gasped, her face paling as she scanned the documents. "But he's never been a part of Kelvin's life. How can he do this now?" "I don't know," Michael said, his voice tight with anger. "But we're going to fight this. He has no right to disrupt Kelvin's life." They decided to wait until morning to tell Kelvin, wanting to shield him from the stress for at least one more night. When they sat down with Kelvin the next day, his reaction was a mix of anger and fear. "He wants custody?" Kelvin said, his voice rising. "But I don't even know him. I don't want to live with him." Michael placed a reassuring hand on Kelvin's shoulder. "We're going to fight this, Kelvin. You're almost 14. The court will take your wishes into account, and will make sure your voice is heard." Katie nodded, her eyes fierce. "Marcus has a history that the court will have to consider, and you've made it clear you don't want a relationship with him. We'll make sure the judge knows that." The next few weeks were tense as Michael and Katie worked with their attorney, Mr. Cooley, to build their case. They gathered evidence of Marcus's criminal record, his history of abusive behavior, and his complete absence from Kelvin's life. Elena also agreed to testify, providing a first-hand account of Marcus's behavior and the reasons she had made the decision to give Kelvin up for adoption. Elena called Kelvin one evening to check in, I'm so sorry this is happening, she said, her voice heavy with guilt. If I had known that telling my family would lead to this, I would have been more careful. It's not your fault, Kelvin said firmly. You couldn't have known. And I'm glad I met you and Shelley. I don't regret that. Her voice softened. We're all here for you, Kelvin, whatever you need. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and Kelvin sat nervously in the courtroom beside Michael and Katie. Across the room, Marcus sat with his own attorney, his expression smug and self-assured. Kelvin couldn't help but feel a surge of anger as he looked at the man who had caused so much pain for Elena. And now, for him. The hearing was emotionally charged. Mr. Cooley presented a compelling case, emphasizing Marcus's absence from Kelvin's life, his criminal history, and Kelvin's clear desire to remain with his adoptive parents. Elena's testimony was particularly powerful, as she recounted the fear and abuse she had endured during her relationship with Marcus. I gave Kelvin up because I wanted him to be safe, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, and I don't believe Marcus is capable of providing that for him. Finally, it was Kelvin's turn to speak. The judge asked him directly, Kelvin, how do you feel about this situation? Do you want a relationship with your biological father? Kelvin took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. No, Your Honor, he said, his voice clear and resolute. I don't know Marcus, and from what I've learned about him, I don't think he's someone I want in my life. I'm happy with my family. Michael and Katie are my real parents. I don't want anything to change. The judge nodded, taking notes. After several hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge made her ruling. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that Mr. Whitfield has not been involved in Kevin's life and does not have a stable history that would support joint custody. I am denying Mr. Whitfield's petition for custody. Kevin will remain in the care of his adoptive parents, Michael and Katie Clark. Relief washed over the Clarks as the judge's words sank in. Marcus's face darkened with anger. Marcus begins to lash out in the midst of the judge's ruling. Marcu was removed from the courtroom by force. For the first time in a long time, Kelvin felt a deep sense of belonging. He didn't need a relationship with Marcus to feel complete. He had two families who loved him, and that was more than enough. In the days following the custody hearing, Kelvin finally felt a sense of peace. The ruling had affirmed what he already knew in his heart. His life with Michael and Katie was exactly where he belonged. He had begun to embrace the presence of Elena, Dan, and Shelley in his life as an extended family, and for the first time, he felt his story had a sense of completeness. However, the calm didn't last long. One evening, as Michael was finishing up the dishes and Katie was helping Kelvin with his science project, the phone rang. Michael wiped his hands on a dish towel and answered it. Hello? Mr. Clark, this is Officer Jennings with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling to inform you that Marcus Whitfield attempted to escape custody during the hearing last week. He is now facing additional charges and will remain incarcerated for the foreseeable future. Michael froze. Escape custody? What happened? Officer Jennings explained. Apparently, Marcus used the custody hearing as an opportunity. During a bathroom break after his removal, he managed to overpower a deputy and attempted to flee the courthouse. He didn't make it far, and we apprehended him before he left the premises. We've since learned through his cellmate that Marcus had been planning this for weeks, using the hearing as a pretext to get out of the prison. Michael's grip on the phone tightened. So, he never actually wanted custody of Kelvin. It appears that way, the officer confirmed. We're still investigating, but based on the testimony from his cellmate and the evidence we've gathered, this was part of an escape plan. I thought you and your family should know in case you had concerns about his intentions toward your son. Michael thanked the officer and hung up, his emotions swirling between anger and relief. He walked into the living room, where Katie and Kelvin were leaning over the dining table, deep in conversation about Kelvin's project. Michael? Katie asked, sensing something was wrong. What is it? Michael took a deep breath and explained the situation. As he spoke, Kelvin's face shifted from surprise to disbelief. So, he didn't even really care about me, Kelvin said quietly. He just wanted to use the hearing to get out. Michael sat down beside him. Kelvin, I know this might feel like a lot to take in, but the important thing is that this doesn't change who you are or the life you've built. Marcus's actions are about him, not you. Katie placed a comforting hand on Kelvin's shoulder. You are loved, Kelvin, by us, by Elena, by Shelley. Nothing Marcus does can take that away. Kelvin nodded slowly, processing the news. I guess I always kind of knew he wasn't the kind of person I'd want in my life. This just proves it. I'm glad I didn't meet him. Michael and Katie exchanged a look, proud of their son's maturity. Despite everything, Kelvin continued to handle life's challenges with grace and strength. The news about Marcus's failed escape eventually reached Elena, who called Michael the following day. Michael, I just heard about Marcus, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and relief. I can't believe he would do something like this. I'm so glad the court saw through him. Me too, Michael replied. Kelvin's taking it well, but I can tell it's weighing on him. I'll talk to him, Elena said. He's such a good kid, and I want him to know none of this is his fault. That weekend, Kelvin visited Elena and her family again. Shelley greeted him at the door with her usual enthusiasm, throwing her arms around him. Kevin, she squealed, I made another picture for you. Kelvin smiled and ruffled her hair. Thanks, Shelley. Let's put it on the fridge. Elena watched the two of them with a soft smile. Later, as they sat on the couch, she spoke to Kelvin privately. I heard about what Marcus tried to do, she began gently. Kelvin looked down at his hands. Yeah, it's crazy, right? I guess I should have expected something like that from him. Elena placed a hand on his knee. Kelvin, I want you to know something. Marcus's choices are his own, and they don't reflect on you. You are not him, and you don't owe him anything. The man you are becoming is incredible, and I'm so proud of you. Kelvin looked up at her, his eyes brimming with emotion. Thanks, Elena. That means a lot. As the weeks passed, life settled into a new normal. Kelvin continued to build relationships with Elena, Dan, and Shelley, while cherishing the love and support of Michael and Katie. The escape attempt and custody hearing became a distant memory, overshadowed by the joy of family dinners, shared laughter, and the simple comfort of knowing he was surrounded by people who truly cared for him. One evening, as Kelvin sat with Michael and Katie on the porch watching the sunset, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. I'm lucky, he said suddenly. Michael looked over, raising an eyebrow. What makes you say that? Kelvin shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. I've got two amazing families. Not everyone gets that. I don't need Marcus in my life to feel complete. I already have everything I need. Katie leaned over and kissed the top of his head. And we're lucky to have you, Kelvin. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of the setting sun wrapping around them like a blanket. Kelvin knew there would always be challenges in life, but he also knew he had the strength and support to face them. And that was more than enough. If you enjoyed our tale, please like and subscribe to our channel, Green Tea Tales. Thank you.